How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I've got a very special guest for you all. Today, I'm joined by strength coach, chiropractor. I've listened to him on other podcasts. He's absolutely awesome. Today, I am joined by the one and only Dr. Brandon Parker. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good. I mean, now I feel like I have to live up to a specific standard here. So thank you for putting me on a pedestal.
No worries at all. But yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. How are you? What's been happening in your world recently?
Everything has been spectacular, man. I mean, when it comes to getting out of school, I was basically thrown into being an entrepreneur. And if anybody has been a coach slash entrepreneur, you don't have any time. And this is the first time in a long time I have my ducks kind of in line where I actually can start connecting with people. And I feel like the second that I started to do that, things are starting to move at an exponential rate. Now, let me ask you, does coaches listen to this podcast?
Coaches, people interested in strength training, gym
Uh-huh.
owners. It's grown to a wider audience than
That's
what I maybe
awesome.
originally thought it was.
That's awesome. So what I would say is this is anybody that's listening, and because I feel like this is regardless of the industry, is like the one and only thing that you should be focusing on outside of things that I already know you're focusing on. Get out there, meet people that have the same interests as you, because I was just like, no, I got to focus on my job. I got to focus on building the business. And things felt like a grind. But the second that I started to talk to people that are in my world, things were just exponentially easier. So that was a big reflection point for me in 2024. And I'm hoping that I can kind of instill that on other people.
Yeah, nice. And I think I think sometimes you might realize throughout this chat that I don't mind a tangent every now and again. But I think especially it seems ages since we spoke about COVID, but I think people are wanting to talk to people because I remember years ago it was very much a case of like coaches and trainers wouldn't really speak to each other. It was very much like competition, whereas
Yeah.
now it's a lot more kind of I don't want to say like networking, but more like collaboration, learning from each other, and
Yes.
driving standards higher. I know whether it's selfish or not, why I enjoy keep doing this podcast and keep the name Strength Chat is just generally having conversations. It helps me develop as a coach, and I like to think that for everybody listening, it helps them develop whether it's a strength or fitness enthusiast to a coach. Do you kind of agree with that?
I 1000%. So I mean, I use my podcast, yes, to get information out there, but also on a more personal level, it's my way of connecting, right? Like
Yeah.
the cool thing about this is I can already tell you and I are going to be friends, right? So like this 1 hour conversation or whatever it may be, it's going to have a meta impact on both of our trajectories in our career field. And I hope that I can be an asset to you in any way and vice versa. So I 1000% agree.
Cool. And it's always nice to have different holiday destinations where you can go as well, which is always good. Um,
Exactly.
I know I did quite a brief introduction there, but for everyone listening who might not know your background in terms of, training, education, and basically to the point where you're at now, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I'll give a little bit of context. I don't want it to be too long-winded here, but I was a strength and conditioning coach in the private sector, similar to you, very, very interested in the sports and performance world. And it just became a grind. It was just to the point where I was waking up very early, going to bed late at night, and I was missing dinner with my family. And as a
Yeah,
fan, like I always wanted to be a family man. It's like, I feel like this is contradictory, right?
yeah,
So, even though we were getting great results working with the athletes that we were, focusing on injury prevention to the best that we can, building strength where it matters most, I told myself that I need to build up my scope of practice so I can start calling my own shots, setting my own calendar. And
yeah.
then it was a fork in the road. It was like, do I become a chiropractor or a physical therapist? Right now, or at least when I was going through school, Florida, if you are a physical therapist, one, you're only working with the older population that only wants to do basically knee replacements, hip replacements, and they hate being there. It's like, that doesn't sound like me. And then number two, at the time, as a physical therapist, you needed a referral from another physician. So there was a lot of red tape there. Whereas I just wanted to be a strength coach that had a large scope of practice. And
Yeah.
that brought me down the route of becoming a chiropractor. In the school of chiropractic, I learned that unfortunately, schools are forced to teach for the boards. You get graded on how many people are successfully graduating and becoming licensed. And the boards are so outdated. So unfortunately, in your schooling, you have to learn what the boards want you to listen to or do, and then you have to learn on your own. So it kind of became I didn't feel good about the chiropractic schooling because of that, and it made me a little bit jaded. So I graduated as the valedictorian of my class, so I can pass a bunch of judgment. So nobody can say like, "Well, you were the last in the class, that's why you didn't like the schooling." It's like, no, I was ahead of all of you, and this is what we need to fix.
Yeah,
Um, all that to say, I decided to open up practice and practice the way that I thought everyone should get from a healthcare professional, where it's let me listen to you, let me listen to your goals, let me educate you properly so you're not scared and to use your body. And then we just embark on this journey together because in rehabilitation, fitness, nothing's linear, right? So you have to have that guy that will be by your side or that girl by your side and just when you start to doubt yourself, because we're humans and we do that, to basically get you back on track. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm an online coach, I'm a chiropractor, but I practice the same regardless if I see you in person or not. We just make sure that we have a game plan, we attack it, and we modify it when we need to.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point because I think sometimes, especially when it comes to learning, it's kind of well, that's it. Like, okay, I'm just gonna accept what that is. Which don't get me wrong, there's some things that you can do that with, but sometimes I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to. I don't know whether challenge is the right word, or it might be. To think about, well, could we do this a better way? Could we do this a different way? Which I don't think is a bad thing because when you're training with people or working with people, sorry, there's so many different variables that you need to use and take into account. Is that what you've kind of found from in person and online?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And it's so funny because when I was coming out of school, I was really into the pain science of everything. And you look at the research, you have people with torn rotator cuffs, disc bulges, herniations, severe arthritis. They have no pain at all. And you start to think to yourself like, whoa, maybe a lot of this pain syndromes is more complex. Maybe that their social environment or the stresses that they're placing on their body, like psychologically, has more to do with an actual physical state. But then you go down this path where it's a little too extreme, where like you have to basically try to educate them, but also make it not sound like, hey, this is all in your head. You're making this up, right? So, like, as a new clinician, I had to basically learn that rule and smash expectations, but in a way that they were actually receptive. Because if you can't toe that line, you're going to be out of business pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And touching on that, because like when you mentioned, the when clients, athletes, people are coming, with pain or wanting to start their strength or fitness journey, if you like, there does seem to be sometimes a fear attached with certain elements, that they're gonna hurt themselves or they can't lift too much. And if they do lift too much, they're going to all of a sudden, walk out running, looking like Ronnie Coleman or something like that. So I suppose the first question is, what are your thoughts on why that is? Where does that fear stem from? And kind of, from that very first meeting or first session with a client, how do you kind of try and break those barriers down, really?
Yeah. I would say that it stems from a couple of sources, and nothing is ever as simple as we describe it. But from my personal experience, first, I think a lot of it's rooted in just not knowing. And when you don't know, we're ingrained to feel fear because we'll stay within our comfortable little bubble, even if it's uncomfortable, but we know our surroundings. So when there is a pain that we can't describe or we just don't know the, let's say, general anatomy around it, we're going to be scared. And what is the safest bet that we can do? Nothing at all. Just do nothing,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
you and I both know if we were to do nothing at all, that actually creates more problems down the line, but people don't see that or people
yeah,
don't really think about it in that way. So that's the first place. Second of all, I've had to unpack complex conversations with people that were educated incorrectly by physicians that are running a practice that is just too high volume. Now, if I have to go into a room with you and you have no idea what your spinal anatomy even looks like, and I have to explain to you, hey, you have a disc herniation, and I have less than 10 minutes, and the average American has a third grade reading level, that is a very hard problem to solve. And what happens is because of the time constraints, people oversimplify and they basically say, "Hey, the disc in your spine, which they already don't know what that is, it herniated. It's like basically pushing on a nerve, and if you don't relieve this pressure, then you're going to lose this strength, and then your back is fragile." And then like basically they try to oversimplify. Now the person's left confused and now even more scared. And most of the time that I'm working with somebody, I have to educate them in a way where it's like, just so you know, just like your muscles, just like your ligaments, your disc, all that responds positively to exercise. Now, think about what happened. Do you think you bending over, slightly twisting to pick up your wallet was the thing that actually broke your back? Or was the fact that you haven't exercised in years, you've been stressed out of your mind, your diet is nowhere aligned with what you want to be doing in life, and then that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, I guess pun
Yeah.
intended, right? So when you start to unpack that and you guide them with questions, they're not going to be defensive. So I guess like where I start is be unbelievably curious, and my tailored questions will bring them to their own, I would say their own thought process of like, oh, maybe my back is much stronger than I thought. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And kind of two follow-up questions that were kind of going through from my mind there. It's interesting you mentioned about time because we have a relationship with a physio. So I'm based. I don't know how well you know the UK, but I'm just based on the outskirts of Leeds, just in the
Okay.
north of England. We've got a relationship with a physio, very busy, but very good. And basically, he sends us the information so we can work a little bit closely with him rather than which. Again, this could be another rabbit hole we go down is, trainers diagnosing things outside of their scope of practice, which I think is dangerous. But when you said there about time and oversimplifying it, do you think that's a case of just trying to that's maybe stresses on the therapist, on the trainer, trying to just get as much business as they can because right now it is competitive. But also, what are your thoughts on because I've worked with other physios in the past who actually don't train themselves. So if they say, look, don't do this movement, it's because they have not experienced it themselves. Whereas, the best physios I've worked with and therapists are, okay, you can do this, but we're just gonna alter it, adjust it a little bit. What kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that I get it when it comes to business. I mean, when me running my own business, there has to be some type of systemization and you have to keep a certain pace. But I think that what I'm not going to say the way I do things is perfect, but what I found to help me a lot is when you spend enough time up front and you set foundations, those follow-up visits don't need to be as long, right? It's more so the system that you place them through. So my first couple appointments, especially like when we're reintegrating movement and they might experience a flare-up, that you have to be there with them. Just like, hey, we expected this flare-up to happen. Your body is hypersensitized. It's freaking out because you haven't bent before in like the last 2 years. But do you really think your spine was hurt because you did a cat cow? No? All right, cool. So let's just, modify this flare up a little bit. Let's see what we can get away with. And as you start to plant those seeds and you set that foundation, then it really does just become, hey, I'm coming in to check in. Let's refine a couple of these programming points. And then we can start to maybe explore new movement patterns and see how you do with those. But I think that with the lack of maybe the foundational educational components, then it just turns into people staying confused, people getting overtreated, and when they actually feel better, they don't even know why. They're just like, I just feel better now, and then they just repeat the same pattern again. And that's, I mean, look, things happen, injuries happen, but If you come in with the same injury because you did the same thing, that's like the definition of not learning, right?
Yeah,
And as a doctor, or root meaning of doctor is teacher,
yeah.
right? And that's kind of how I see that. I forgot the secondary question. I'm sorry, I have ADHD.
No, no, no. That made sense. The second part was kind of, when physical therapists, physios are, training themselves and have an understanding, because exactly like what you said there, for the first part, taking them through the exercise, explaining them. I could see you were thinking about the questions that you would ask, like the level of communication that you could
Yes.
use. So it's not fear mongering. It's like, well, do you think that was it, or do you think it was maybe poor training or lack of movement or whatever it was that built up over time to then to this point where it's not as good. Do you think that sometimes, because maybe some trainers or some trainers physios don't train themselves, that there's not a good understanding of it? Because just to have a little bit of an idea or an example that I had in mind, had a power lifter. She was really, really strong. Done a couple of competitions, and basically went to the physio. And then she said, "Yes, I do strength training." Obviously, there's different levels of strength training. Strength is relative to the person. And she got told, "Okay, cool. Just don't lift as much. Just do this." Whereas actually, in terms of her numbers, she's deadlifting well over 120. She can squat over 100. She can bench over 50. So it's kind of like she still wants to come into the gym and actually lift something and feel like she's working. Do you think sometimes that's, because of time or knowledge of actually training principles, regardless of the knowledge of the human body, just training principles, that's where sometimes the advice and recommendations aren't suited to that person, and it's just kind of, which is in sometimes a good thing, like a generalist approach, rather than being like, all right, asking more questions about their training, how much are they lifting, if that kind of makes sense.
That makes complete sense. I mean, if you scroll on social media, you'll see some person like advice from an orthopedic surgeon. And it's like, I will never squat with my knees past my toes. And just like clearly that's what you look like, right? So like it's those people that make these generalistic fear-mongering examples of what they would never do. Like, I would never deadlift. And it's just like, okay, but if I'm a power lifter and that's my identity and that makes me happy, you are not a match for me. And I don't think you should be a match for anybody because you don't want to feel, once again, you want to make people fear to bend over, especially if that's a primary movement pattern of our life, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But to your point, I totally agree. It's like, all right, so if a weightlifter or Olympic lifter came to me, past manipulating their load management, and I would say some of their technique, I would rather work closely with somebody that only works with Olympic athletes, or I should say Olympic lifting athletes, because I can then have an educational conversation saying, look, this rotator cuff is clearly overworked. We need to down regulate that rotator cuff. However, I know that this person has goals. I know that maybe they have a meet in about 4 months. What can we do together? How can we offload this rotator cuff while still building the primary principles or primary areas that's going to get this lift to skyrocket in the future, right?
yeah,
It's I can't help but think, but are you familiar with Louis Simmons and West Side Barbell?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So Louis Simmons, for those that are listening, if you don't know, he's the godfather of powerlifting. He destroyed his lower back, and the reason why I say that is he herniated a bunch of them, right? And instead of him deadlifting, because that was a movement that was really problematic for him, he just did a lot of back extensions. He did a lot of sled pulls, and then a couple years later, when he finally was ready to get back on the platform, he ended up PRing his deadlift. And it's just with that thought process of, well, I'm still going to build up these areas and get them strong. I'm just going to meet my body where it currently is. He was
yeah,
still able to perform. He was still able to be active in a way that was aligned with his identity. So he didn't feel socially isolated. Right. And
yeah,
that's kind of what doctors should be doing is like realizing that there's nuance to these sports, specifically at a higher level. And you need to go to a coach that's in it, that lives it and breathes it. Because when I talk to this Olympic weightlifting coach, they can say, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We'll switch this movement out. We'll put this movement in. We'll still be able to be on the right path. But the chances of this person overreaching is going to be much lower. And that is what I would be considering optimization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It goes back to, what we said at the start of the episode of, it's collaborating, working with people who have that knowledge because, most coaches, most trainers will have a good understanding, but to like what I mentioned earlier of, being able to diagnose or say this is it. It's sometimes you need that help to be like, well, this is actually what's causing it, because it's not going to be that cat cow within that moment that did it. It's gonna be a build up from there. Touching on Louis Simmons because I don't know whether you've seen West Side versus the World, the documentary film that came out. Awesome film, and you get that understanding of beyond just sort of like the lifting, how like Louis Simmons, basically designed all of these machines, exercise to help with his lower back. Do you think that, and this might be new information to a lot of people listening, that the fact that, West Side, powerlifting, you could even maybe say like CrossFit and all the other kind of like strength sports, what only gets highlighted is them lifting really heavy weights or at competition and kind of the things that go on behind the scenes. Do you
Yeah.
think that maybe down from that like elite level, if you like, for like the general population and general coaches, they kind of tie into that thing of, yeah, you've got to grind, you've got to like just lift heavy all the time, that they just try and bypass that rather than like what you mentioned earlier about actually educating people and being like, yes, for all, West Side Barbell was like, yeah, let's get after it, let's lift heavy. He was actually quite smart in his
Yeah.
programming, and there's a reason why people are still using that training method. Still, it stood the test of time.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so for those of you who are listening that are not really familiar, to oversimplify the conjugate method, there's days that you focused on lifting heavy, and there's other days that you focused on lifting fast. And the reason why they broke it into these days is because if you lift heavy every day, your body's going to feel basically run down and not be able to put out the same amount of effort. And he came up with a method where he can still work on producing force in a fast manner, to allow the body to recover, but also still practice the movement patterns in which his sport demanded of. So it was genius, in my opinion. Like I never reached a high level of powerlifting, but of course, as a curious physician, I ran conjugate method for about a year and definitely felt strong. Definitely. Didn't have any aches or pains. I was basically lifting more weight than I've ever lifted, and I didn't have any aches or pains. But just as a small caveat is I will say that we can't compare ourselves to those who are not only genetically gifted, because Louis Simmons definitely picked the cream of the crop, but also too, like, let's be real, in that sport there's going to be geared lifting. They
Yeah,
are going to be on performance enhancers, so the recovery is much higher. So with those caveats, you just have to understand, like, hey, the formula works, but the amount of output that they're doing, we just have to bring it back down to a realistic level.
yeah,
Because in my experience, and this is a number I'm throwing out there, but I want to use this number to kind of prove a point or make a point, is like 90% of the people that I work with some type of legitimate injury isn't the exercise choice. It's just the load management behind it, where it's like, okay, you have a pec tendon tear, or maybe just like a grade two strain, something of the sort. It's like, okay, what's your training look like? It's like, I bench 4 days a week. Well, maybe that's the problem, you know? So when you start to like look at how much dosage you're putting in a certain area, usually that's the issue and not the actual movement itself.
yeah, absolutely. Because everything gets shown of, that top level, there's lifters I look up to and think, oh yeah, that's cool. But it's similar to, I think I actually had this conversation a couple of weeks ago actually about Eddie Hall, the strongman pulling 500. You know, yes, you could maybe follow the same program that he followed to build his deadlift, but you're not going to use the same percentages. That doesn't mean that you're going to lift 500.
Yeah.
Maybe over time, you never know. But you can still follow those principles and adjust it. And I suppose the next question from that then is, because sometimes, and we touched on this at the start about that fear of strength training
Yeah.
and the knowledge around it. What's kind of what's kind of the cost of not doing strength training, the cost of not, using those principles to put more load on the bar, or not even that, we've got a lot of members and clients that actually, the goblet squat, the
Yeah.
kettlebell deadlift, strength is relative to that. And yeah, what's kind of, because again, you might have experienced this as well. I've had members and clients who have come to me a little bit older, maybe in the 30s, maybe in the 40s. In fact, yeah, we have had some members in the 40s who have just started strength training, but then feel awesome in and outside of the gym. What's kind of the cost of not, doing some form of strength training from kind of your experience? We work with clients.
Yeah. Those who have followed my profile, those have listened to me on podcasts. I'm very middle of the road. Like when it comes to a lot of things, it's more so like principle based, like how does it feel? Are we getting results from it? Things like that. And if we check those boxes, do what you want to do. But one thing that it's a hill that I will die on is every single human being needs to strength train. We are all fighting the I would say the effects of age. When we get older, our ability to maintain muscle mass is going to be harder and harder. So because of the hormonal shifts, because our ability to absorb protein is going to be lowered, we're just not going to be able to have that much tissue on our frame. So what naturally happens? Well, our metabolism slows down. So that happens. Our inflammation, our ability to clear it is lessened, right? So we're going to feel way more stiff, right? So we have an opportunity to put on more body fat because our metabolism slows down. That leads to higher levels of inflammation. Then our ability to clear out the inflammation is also lowered. So that's also an issue. Then let's consider this. Less muscle means less strength, usually. And when we have lower levels of strength, our chances of injury skyrockets. So, in the event that we have an ache or pain that we would have gotten over in a couple of days when we were younger, now takes weeks.
Yeah.
Now, because we are probably a little bit more higher body fat percentage and we can't clear out inflammation, that small ache or pain that would have not mattered much to us when we were younger is now monumental, right? And to take it a step further, just like the example earlier where the powerlifter is serious about powerlifting, this small injury that's now elongated because of the acts of deconditioning, getting older, and all these things, now she's isolated from the things she loves to do. She's isolated from her tribe. So that in itself will play a massive role. Now, let me actually play this out further because this happens to a lot of people. They finally get better. They get back into the gym. They don't have a thorough understanding of load progression, specifically to the fact that they were getting weaker in the time that they're away from the gym. So they go right back to what they were doing before. They get injured again. Now, think about the psychological component to that, where it's like, I'm finally back. I feel great. I'm back with my tribe, injured again. Now you
Yeah.
have to go through that same process again, feel isolated again. Now you're more prone to feeling like, what's the point?
Yeah.
So this all can be avoided if we start to just make sure that we have strength training in our regular routine. And some people might be thinking, I don't have the time, I don't know what to do. Look, if we're looking at strength training as a whole, you can get away with 2 days per week. And if you superset anything or everything, 30 minutes, you have a pair of adjustable dumbbells. You could do it literally anywhere that those dumbbells are. And to cap this off is I don't have the exact research in my head, but it's around this. It's like per 1,000 hours of strength training, I think it's 1 to 2 injuries. So like if we're talking about you exercising 30 minutes a session twice per week, that's an hour. So 1,000 weeks from now, you might get injured, perhaps, right? It's a pretty safe bet that there's a lot of reward for a very non-existent risk, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I actually think I remember it was like I can't remember if it was like a research study or an article, but I do actually remember reading something along those lines. It was kind of like yeah, the actual percentage or the risk of injury is actually quite low. It's like it was something like you're more likely to be injured doing, X, Y, or Z rather than strength training. And
Exactly.
the thing that you mentioned on there about, doing it, twice a week, supersetting things in terms of we mentioned before about the levels of strength.
Hmm.
Strength training, people always think that it's going to be barbells, they need to be using machines, But what's kind of your approach when you are talking about strength training? Can people do body weight strength training, body weight exercises, and progress from there? Because you think about the things that hold people back from training. You mentioned it there. Time, family commitments, work, previous injuries. They're scared of getting hurt again, which we've touched on.
Yeah.
What's kind of your approach when people are looking on that and looking at the levels of strength training? Like, does it matter? Or, the thing that I enjoy about strength training is that it's endless. You can always like make progress and it's something for life. What's kind of your approach or thought process around that?
Yeah, I love to take everything back down to a principle, right? You and I both know when it comes to rep ranges, of course, they're going to have a different adaptation. But in terms of building muscle, we got basically reps from like 5 all the way up to 30 reps. As long as you reach that level of exertion, you're going to be building the same amount of muscle, right? And when I work with people, especially in the rehab sense, or just they haven't been to the gym, they feel a little bit fearful, I just tell them this: barbells, dumbbells, resistance bands, anything that adds more intensity to your already body weight exercises that we can do is just a tool. So it's just like, all right, you don't want to do body weight or you don't want to do barbell exercises. Let's do a body weight squat. And then by the time they get to like 20 reps, they're like, this kind of sucks. It's like, yeah, you still got 10 more to go, by the way, and you're nowhere near exertion. Do you think that we can just maybe hold a 10-pound, 20-pound dumbbell and maybe only do like 10 reps? And people go, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And when you start leading them down this path of like, look, we're just using these as tools so we can make our weightlifting routine more, well, one more efficient, but also two transferable to your day-to-day activities, people start to be a little bit more open to it because it's the idea of this. Like, I had somebody that had chronic hip pain and I had them lay on their side and lift their leg up just to check how their glute medius was working, right? And they got it up to their top position and it was shaking like an absolute leaf, like it was struggling against gravity. And then I don't have to like really over explain that. It's just like you play pickleball with a lot of lateral movement and how much do you weigh? Over 100 plus pounds and you can't even beat gravity right now. Does it make sense that once we get this stronger, that we have to add weight to match your current activities? And everyone's like, yeah, no problem. So going down that path, you don't even have to talk people into it. They just be like, oh, this is going to make me not hurt and play better. And then people are going to ask me what my secret is. Done, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And outside of, because I think that's a really good point, especially about the because I actually had a similar conversation with a member earlier in the week where he just kept doing more reps, and I was like, but what's the next goal? Like, if you're doing 10 reps now, next week are you gonna do 20? Are you gonna do 30? Are you gonna do 40? Like, what happens if you get to 100 reps? Like, you train on a lunchtime, that's going to take longer. You've got like five more exercises to do. Like, you're going to be in here all day. Shall we just increase the weight? And then that way, and then he's like, oh yeah, that does make more sense. So yeah, I really like that. In terms of the one thing that you said there about applying it to like real life.
Hmm.
And like what I mentioned at the start of, outside of because I think in terms of strength, I think the entry point to compete in powerlifting, probably I would include strongman in that, high rocks, CrossFit, maybe weightlifting might take a little bit longer to because it may be like a little bit more technical, but the entry point to compete is relatively low. Anyone can rock up and give it a go, because another thing that you mentioned earlier was like being part of their social circle, their tribe. I think the community part plays a big role in that, which
1,000%.
people gravitate towards. For the general population that are maybe in that realm of, they've maybe been strength training a little bit, or are just starting and not at that point yet of, yeah, do you know what? I do want to do a competition, or I want to do something like that. Do you think sometimes it's hard to think, using a barbell, how does that carry over to real world life? The example that I would use is, or the example I use when it's deadlifting. Have you ever picked your kid up off the floor, or your dog up off the floor, or you're moving house? And I sometimes see them look and twist and turn their head and think, yeah, but that's not a barbell. Like, I don't set myself up. But how do you kind of say, well, the more strength that we build here, you can
Mhm.
pick both your kids up or both your dogs up, or or do whatever. How do you kind of, or what cues or approach do you use to let them know that it is going to benefit the real world? Because
Yeah.
I think, speaking for myself and from other coaches as well, sometimes that can be hard because you get so into the maybe the technique side of things that in the real world you're maybe not going to have perfect form. You're not going to be able to. I think you mentioned it earlier. You're going to twist and pick something up, and that's going to hurt your back.
Yeah.
How can strength training, benefit the real world without focusing on all that technique? A long-winded question, but
No,
hopefully
I
that
like
makes
it.
sense.
I this is why I really like my clinic a lot. Like we have all the staples, but we are pretty constrained in some of the weight selections, right? And the reason why I like it so much is like, let's just say somebody just has this huge fear of the barbell deadlift or barbell, right? It gets to a point where it's like, all right, well, we're going to practice the deadlift with this kettlebell here, 30 pounds. They're going to build a confidence level where it's like, well, the next one that we have is 100 plus pounds. Do you want to try that? And they're like, well, I went from 30 to 100. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like, well, we could try is we can go grab this barbell here and get that right between method where it's a little bit more than 30 and not clearly under 100. Are you open to that? And then just because of the power of constraints where it's just like, well, I'm definitely not going to do 100. I guess I'll give it a shot. And once again, it really I guide people to what they want to do. I never force people into anything because here's the thing, rehab's an art, right? Like we can follow the science and we can try to work with the patient, but you can do everything perfect. If life hits them in the face and they don't sleep and they get a flare, they're going to blame you. It is what it is because they just don't know better. So I always make sure that it's a collaborative process where they thoroughly understand that the barbell is a tool. And if you don't want to use that tool for this particular thing, fine. But it's like the idea of building a house and refusing to use a hammer, right? It just
Yeah,
kind of like you let's use the tool that's best for this current circumstance. But in that moment, we both have to agree that it is. Because if I agree and they don't, then it's like, okay, let's pivot, let's figure something out. And that's usually when I go. So back to the example of maybe the 30 body weight squats, it's like, all right, well, if you don't want to go heavier, let's do a Bulgarian split squat, but body weight. And everyone's like, no, 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 I'll go heavier, I'll go heavier. So,
yeah,
so like
yeah,
you present these options, and of course you strategically present them in a way that you guide them in the direction that you believe is best for them, because that's what your job is as a coach. But ultimately, you have to build that confidence within the client and patient where they do call their shots, and then at the end of them calling them shots, it's a positive outcome. Because if they call the shots and it's negative, and it's like, ooh, maybe as a coach I shouldn't have brought them down that path. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
yeah, definitely. And I suppose um, looking at from the client's point of view, and they're looking at coaches, is that kind of, and I'll hold my hands up. I've been guilty of this in the past. A lot younger and inexperienced. Competing in powerlifting. Playing rugby. It's like everybody needs to do powerlifting. Everybody needs to do some form of like sport specific strength conditioning. Whereas actually, like what you mentioned there, give them options. What's gonna work? What's gonna work best from the client's point of view? Is that something? Because I'm a big fan of having it as like a team approach. Look, we're both in this together. You
Yes.
know what you want to achieve. I've got the knowledge to help you get that. How can we work together so that you enjoy it, I enjoy it, and we get the results that you want? Do you think sometimes that from the client's point of view that they shouldn't be afraid of speaking up, asking questions? Again, yeah, I would probably say challenging the trainer from there. Have you kind of like had experience from that, or actually tried to push clients to be like, look, ask me questions. Let's think about this
Oh yeah.
together. Because I've also had clients, and you might be the same as well, where you can say something, they'll do it. As humans, we make mistakes and think like, oh no, actually, we're gonna do this now, and they
Yeah.
just kind of go with it rather than being like, are you sure that's right? How do you approach that?
That's a great question. So everything I do is a collaboration, and I would consider myself an over communicator. Now, I'd rather be over than under. And like, all right, for example, just my one of my long-term clients, she came to a knee pain. Now she's doing sissy squats, which is pretty cool. But with long term training, aches and pains are going to come, right? Like if we're pushing the stimulus in the gym and for some reason they've been stressed out and haven't been sleeping, aches and pains are going to come. So I tell her at any point in time, if something is presenting with pain, you have to let me know because that is going to dictate what's going on. And as the client gets a little bit more of a foundational knowledge, like I know that they can move pretty well, I'll simply say, hey, this is what I had planned for you today. But the principle behind today's lift is we're really building up your quads. Okay. So if we're really building up your quads, here's the three options that I had in mind. What do you think about one of these three? I'll let them pick. Now, obviously, if we are presenting options, we don't want to give them something that we know that they can sandbag, right? Like they're not picking the easiest option because they're just human and they want to pick the easiest outcome, but you want to give them that autonomy. So I'm always asking for feedback. I always, just like how we got on this podcast before, I tell you that I have no ego. I'm a dude that went to school, learned principles, and I make mistakes every day and I try to learn as best as I can. And when I become a human, I present myself as a human to my clients, there is just such a synergistic approach where somebody be like, I really hate this exercise. All right, cool. We're just trying to focus your quads. So let's just switch it up. I don't care. Like, I care about you being here for the long haul because if you are sustainable and consistent, that's going to be the biggest driver of an adaptation anyway. So that's kind of the approach that I always take.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that thing of a little bit like what you mentioned about the more reps on the squats, giving people an option. Whereas, the fight back resistance or short-lived lifespan of a client is that kind of that dictatorship because, people don't like being told this is exact. I mean, I am a believer in that sometimes as the coach or the therapist, you have to kind of take that lead sometimes and be
Sure.
like, you can do this, absolutely, but we also need to do this as well, which is I think is a good approach to have because again maybe a little bit of a tangent there, but our tangent here is there needs to be that boundary of coach client because
Yep.
even though it's a collaborative approach, the number one rule that I've always worked by is don't injure your clients, don't push them to the point where they're not enjoying it or at breaking point. There needs to be that clear boundary, but absolutely giving them choices and being like, look, we're going to do a type of squat. What type of squat are you going to do? Like what you
Yeah.
said, what type of hinge? And then that way, from just a coaching principle point, you're going to get a lot more buy-in. They're going to enjoy your training. As the coach, you're going to enjoy and enjoy those sessions a little bit more. So yeah, quite a few useful tips in there. The last question that I like to ask Brandon is from everything that we've spoken about there, and for everyone listening, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom from what we've chatted about there?
Now, of course, after I say something like this, it's always gonna be like, dang, I should have said something else. But I think that, and I just wanted to respond to that last thing you said, and I totally agree. We don't want to create an environment where it's too loosey goosey, where it's just like, dude, I'm paying you to take stress off my plate. Like, stop making me pick things. But you have to find that balance for sure. And also, you do have those clients that I would consider what we call grinders. Like grind through things because that's how they became successful in their life, right? And it's like you can't do that with pain and injury in exercise because eventually something's going to break. So I totally agree with that. Finding that balance, I would consider that is the art of being a coach, like reading the room, is something that needs to be said. And I think that you only get it when you are in the room, right? And you get your reps and you go, oh, clearly they're not enjoying this. And I'm not even dead set on this exercise. Let's switch it up. Let's make it a little bit better, right? But I guess the word of wisdom that I would love to leave on the listeners here is just like your body's an amazing thing, right? With the proper environment, it will adapt to the specific stresses you place on it. So if you feel like one, things aren't going your way with training, ask yourself, what is the type of stresses that you're placing on your body and how is your body currently adapting? Now, if you're somebody that's kind of currently in a rut, Maybe it's because there's an absence of stress, and that's why things are not going according to plan. Because if we can zoom out and we can have this like bird's eye approach of just like, what is my body currently experiencing? We can modify our training to make sure that we are back on track and being consistent. Because, hey, if I zoom out and I go, this isn't the season where I'm pushing PRs. This is the season that I started my business. For everyone that's listening, this is a small tangent. I ran over my wife's foot the day before our wedding. Okay.
Oh,
And it was like, I can't believe this happened. And she had to get emergency surgery the day after our wedding. And for the next 6 months, not only was I rehabilitating her foot, I was also the primary caretaker of her and the house. And I still had to still be a people person to my clients. I was essentially a shell of myself. And in that season of my life, it would be so foolish of me to be like, you know what? I'm going to go for a PR here. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, right?
yeah.
So when we're experiencing this situation of maybe like I feel burnt out, maybe I feel like there's aches and pains that I can't really explain, zoom out, see what stresses are being placed on the body. If they are something that you can control, get them to the level that you need them. If you can't control them, do your best, but also make sure that you're not adding even more stress in a way that it's counterintuitive. And that's from a coach, that is from a physician, that's from a person standpoint. Because if we can create that awareness, that sensation of like, I don't know and I'm scared slowly becomes more clear, and you know that you're not going to be so much out of control. So, I guess just to wrap this up in a nutshell, build awareness around what's going on in your life and your training. If there's issues, see if you can control it. If you can't, do your best. And then from there, you can modify your training to make sure that it's a benefit and not a drawback. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a couple of words of wisdom in there, and yeah, throughout the entire chat, I think some really helpful content for everybody, and as well maybe a little bit of myth busting around kind of look, actually, there's still thoughts out there, maybe outdated. Things that people still believe, but actually no, it's like you can still do this, you can do that. For everyone listening who might have any questions about what we've spoken about today, reach out to you or see the content you put out there. Where can people find you, Brandon?
So for Instagram, it's going to be Dr. period Brandon period Parker. That is kind of where like my hub is. I also have a podcast called The Revival Method. I usually try to keep the revival method something that's not necessarily common when it comes to podcasts. I feel like both of our podcasts are on the same point of view where it's like, I want to give actionable steps. I want people to listen to it and change a behavior versus just a 3 hour lecture. And I'm like, that was great. I'm not going to do anything about it. So,
Yeah.
those are the two primary areas that you'll see. You'll see me repost a bunch of stuff to YouTube if that's your preferred platform, but that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Brandon, for taking the time to jump on. Really, really enjoyed speaking with you today. Thanks a lot to everybody listening, and I will see you all next week.